Sometimes a man spends his whole life with nothing, wondering if he'll ever catch a break. For one mountain man, that break came in a letter he almost didn't open. He'd inherited a patch of land deep in the frontier, probably worthless, he figured, just rocks and timber. But when he rode out to see it, he found a waterfall more beautiful than anything he'd ever laid eyes on. Behind those falls, hidden in a cavern, he discovered something that would change everything, an outlaw's lost gold and mysterious carvings in ancient stone. Word spread fast. Greedy men came from every direction, ready to take what wasn't theirs. But what was carved in that stone that made them willing to kill? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra Cole had learned long ago that life didn't owe him anything. At 58 years old, his hands were weathered as old leather, his face carved with lines that told stories he rarely shared. He lived alone, in a timber cabin tucked against the Montana Territory's northern ridges, where the wind came down cold, even in summer, and the winters could kill a man who wasn't careful. The cabin was 10 feet by 12. Built from lodgepole pine, he'd cut himself 20 years back. Inside, there wasn't much. A rope bed with a corn husk mattress, a small iron stove he'd traded 3 beaver pelts for, a table he'd built from a single slab of wood, and 1 chair. His clothes hung from pegs on the wall. 2 shirts, 1 pair of wool trousers for winter, canvas pants for warmer months, and a coat that had seen better days. On a shelf above the stove sat his tin plates, a cup, a pot, and a skillet blackened with use. But Ezra didn't think of himself as poor. He'd seen real poverty during the war, families with nothing, children with hollow eyes, homes burned to ash. What he had was enough. He had a roof that didn't leak much, a stove that kept him warm, and trap lines that brought in enough fur to trade for flour, coffee, and bullets. A man could live on less. Every morning before dawn, Ezra would rise and step outside to watch the sun climb over the eastern peaks. He'd stand there in the cold, breath misting, and take stock of the day ahead. Check the trap lines, haul water from the creek, chop wood. Maybe ride down to Samuel's trading post if he had pelts to trade. The routine never changed much, and Ezra found comfort in that. Some men needed excitement. He'd had enough excitement in the war to last 3 lifetimes. His past was something he carried quiet. He'd been a Union soldier, a sergeant in the 5th Infantry, and he'd seen action at Shiloh, Stones River, and Chattanooga. He'd led men, lost men, and come home to find his wife and infant daughter had died of fever while he was gone. The farm they'd worked together had been sold for debt. Everything he'd fought to protect was already gone, so he'd drifted west, like a lot of broken men did. Found work as a scout, then a buffalo hunter, then finally settled into trapping. The mountains didn't ask questions. They didn't care about your past or your pain. They just were, solid and indifferent, and there was something honest about that. Once a month, Ezra would ride the 12 miles down to Samuel Brennan's trading post. Samuel was one of the few people Ezra could call a friend, a thick-built Irishman with a grey beard and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He'd run the post for 15 years, serving trappers, prospectors, and the occasional tribal band that came through for trade. Ezra Cole, Samuel would say every time, like he was surprised to see him. Still alive, I see. Still breathing, Ezra would reply. And they'd both nod, like that settled something important. Samuel knew Ezra could read and write, which set him apart from most mountain men. Ezra's mother had been a school teacher back in Ohio, and she'd made sure all her children knew their letters. It was a skill that felt mostly useless now. But every so often, Samuel would ask him to read a newspaper or help with his account books. And Ezra would oblige. The other person Ezra respected was Running Bear, an elder from the Salish band that hunted the northern valleys. Running Bear was maybe 70, lean as jerky, with silver hair he wore in 2 long braids. He spoke English well enough and had taught Ezra some of the Salish language over the years. They'd share tobacco sometimes, sitting in silence, watching the mountains. Running Bear had once told him, "A man who lives alone too long forgets he is human. You must remember, Ezra Cole, that you still have a heart that beats, Ezra had nodded, but he didn't know what to do with that. His heart beat, sure enough, but it had been a long time since it beat for anything more than survival. His most prized possession wasn't much to look at. A worn saddle he'd bought used in '58, before the war. He'd repaired it so many times, there wasn't much original leather left. Straps had been replaced, the horn rewrapped, the skirt patched with scraps from old boots. But it fit him perfect, and his horse, a sturdy roan mare named Copper, seemed to prefer it over anything new. That saddle had carried him through the war, across 1,000 miles of frontier, and through 20 Montana winters. It was more than a thing. It was a companion. Ezra didn't have family anymore. His parents were long dead. His older brother had been killed at Antietam. His sister had married and moved to California. He hadn't heard from her in a decade. There was an uncle, his father's brother, Nathaniel, but Ezra hadn't seen him since he was a boy. Uncle Nathaniel had been a strange one, a wanderer who showed up at family gatherings with wild stories about the frontier, about mountains and rivers and Indians and gold. Then he'd disappear again for years at a time. The last Ezra had heard, Uncle Nathaniel was somewhere in the Montana Territory, but that had been before the war. For all Ezra knew, the old man was dead. Most evenings, after the work was done, Ezra would sit outside his cabin with a cup of coffee and watch the light fade from the sky. The silence up here wasn't empty. It was full of wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creak of branches, the occasional howl of wolves on a far ridge. He'd learned to hear the difference between the silence that meant peace and the silence that meant danger. He'd think about his life sometimes, wonder if he'd made the right choices. Should he have stayed back east, tried to rebuild? Should he have remarried, started over? But those thoughts never led anywhere useful. A man couldn't live in the past. He could only wake up each morning and do the work in front of him. That was Ezra Cole, in the autumn of 1878, 58 years old. Alone but not lonely, or so he told himself. Poor by most measures, but rich in the quiet dignity of a man who'd survived everything life had thrown at him and was still standing. He had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. That a letter was already waiting for him at Samuel's trading post. That an inheritance he'd never expected would lead him to a place of such beauty and danger. That it would test everything he thought he knew about himself. But for now, in these last days of not knowing, Ezra simply lived. He checked his traplines. He chopped his wood. He watched the sun rise and set over the mountains, and he endured. It was a cold October morning when Ezra rode down to Samuel's trading post, 3 prime beaver pelts rolled behind his saddle. The aspens had turned gold on the hillsides, and there was a bite in the air that promised an early winter. Copper's breath steamed as they descended the narrow trail, her hooves finding purchase on the loose rock with the confidence of long practice. Samuel's post sat in a small valley where 2 streams met. It was a sturdy log building with a covered porch and a stable out back. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Ezra could smell bread baking as he dismounted. A good sign meant Samuel's wife, Mary, was in a cooking mood. "Ezra," Samuel called from the doorway. "I got something for you." Ezra tied Copper to the rail and stomped the dust from his boots. "That's so." Samuel disappeared inside and returned with a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper, with Ezra's name written in careful script. The return address said, Howell and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Helena, Montana Territory. Ezra stared at it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd received a letter. "What's this about?" "Came in on yesterday's stage. Writer said it was important." Samuel handed it over, his eyes curious. "Lawyers don't usually write to mountain men." Ezra turned the envelope over in his hands. It was sealed with red wax, official-looking. Part of him wanted to throw it in the stove unread. Nothing good came from lawyers. But Samuel was watching, and Ezra's curiosity won out. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The words were formal, full of legal language that took him a moment to parse. But the meaning came clear enough. His uncle, Nathaniel Cole, had died 3 months prior. He'd left property to Ezra, a parcel of land in the northern wilderness, coordinates provided. The letter requested Ezra come to Helena to sign papers and receive the deed, but noted that as the sole heir, the land was legally his regardless. Ezra read it twice, then looked up at Samuel. "My uncle's dead. I'm sorry to hear it. I barely knew him." Ezra folded the letter slowly. "Last saw him when I was maybe 10 years old. Didn't even know he was still alive. Says he left you land." Apparently, Ezra felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for a man he'd barely known, suspicion about why Nathaniel would leave him anything, and beneath it all, a small, cautious spark of hope he immediately tried to smother. "Probably worthless, and probably a patch of rocks and scrub pine nobody else wanted." Samuel stroked his beard. "Or maybe not. Man doesn't go through lawyers for worthless land. Maybe he didn't have anyone else to leave it to. That could be." Samuel leaned against the porch rail. "You going to ride up and see it?" Ezra looked at the coordinates written in the lawyer's neat hand. North of here, maybe 3 days' ride into country he'd never trapped. Wild country, the kind that still had grizzlies and wolves and places no white man had properly mapped. "Suppose I should," he said finally. "Be foolish not to at least look." That night, Ezra stayed in Samuel's stable loft, a courtesy extended to him whenever he came down. He lay awake on the hay, the letter folded in his shirt pocket, thinking about Uncle Nathaniel. The memories were fragmentary. A tall man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to look through you. He'd come to visit when Ezra was a boy, stayed a week, and told stories that made Ezra's mother frown. Stories about mountains so tall they scraped the sky, about rivers of gold, about Indians who could track a mouse across bare rock. Young Ezra had been entranced. His father had been less impressed. "Nathaniel's a wanderer," his father had said after his brother left. "No roots, no responsibility. That's no way for a man to live." But lying there in the dark, Ezra wondered if his father had been right. Nathaniel had lived free on his own terms. He'd seen things most men never would. And somehow, despite having no family nearby, he'd acquired property valuable enough to deed to a nephew he barely knew. Among the items mentioned in the lawyer's letter was a small parcel of personal effects being held for Ezra. He'd need to decide whether to make the trip to Helena or have them sent. But the land itself, that he could see now before winter closed the passes. In the morning, Ezra restocked his supplies. Samuel gave him extra coffee and hardtack, and Mary packed him cornbread wrapped in cloth. Running Bear happened by that afternoon, and Ezra showed him the coordinates. The old man studied them, his face unreadable. "That is far north. Cold country. The Blackfeet hunt there sometimes. You know it." "I know of it. There are stories." Running Bear handed the paper back. "Old stories from before my grandfather's time." "What kind of stories?" Running Bear shrugged. "The kind old men tell to pass the time. About the land before the people came. About spirits in the water and voices in the stone." He met Ezra's eyes. "Be respectful if you go there. Some places have long memories." It was the kind of thing Running Bear said sometimes, wisdom wrapped in riddles. Ezra nodded. "I'll be careful. See that you are." Ezra left at dawn the next day. Copper was rested and eager, her ears pricked forward as they climbed into country that grew wilder with each mile. The trail, such as it was, wound through dense pine forests and across high meadows already brown with autumn. He saw elk, a distant bear, and once fresh wolf tracks in the mud near a stream. The first night he camped in a hollow beneath an overhang of rock, building a small fire and eating cold cornbread. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any human light. He thought about Nathaniel out here somewhere, living alone like Ezra did, growing old with only the mountains for company. The second day brought him into country that felt older somehow. The trees were larger, the silence deeper. He crossed a ridge and looked down into a valley so green and pristine it took his breath away. A river ran through it, silver in the afternoon light. According to his compass, a brass instrument he'd found among his gear that morning, he'd tucked in his saddlebag where it hadn't been before. This was close to the coordinates. He studied the compass, puzzled. It was old but well-maintained, and there was an inscription on the back, NC, Find Your Way Home. Nathaniel Cole. His uncle must have left it for him somehow. But how had it gotten into his saddlebag? Samuel must have slipped it in. The lawyer must have sent it ahead. That was the only explanation that made sense. Ezra followed the compass, bearing down into the valley. The sound of water grew louder, not the rush of the river, but something else, a deeper, more powerful sound. He rode through a stand of ancient cedars, and suddenly the forest opened up. Before him stood a waterfall. It was easily 100 feet tall, maybe more, crashing down a cliff face of dark stone into a pool so clear he could see the rocky bottom. Mist rose in rainbows where the light struck it. Ferns grew thick along the banks. The sound was tremendous, a constant thunder that vibrated in his chest. Ezra sat in his saddle, staring. In all his years of wandering the frontier, he'd never seen anything so beautiful. This was his. This impossible, magnificent place. He dismounted slowly, leading Copper to the pool's edge. The water was cold and pure. All around the falls, the forest grew thick and green, fed by the constant mist. Birds he didn't recognize flitted through the branches. The air itself seemed different here, cleaner, charged with something he couldn't name. Ezra made camp that first night on a flat shelf of rock above the pool, sheltered by overhanging cedars. He built a fire and sat watching the waterfall in the fading light, trying to understand what Nathaniel had given him. This wasn't worthless land. This was a treasure, but why had his uncle lived here alone? Why had he left it to Ezra? And what were those stories Running Bear had mentioned, about spirits in the water and voices in the stone? As darkness fell and the fire burned down to coals, Ezra felt something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. Not just about the land, but about the mystery of it. About what else might be hidden in this place. Tomorrow, he decided, he would explore. He would find out what secrets this waterfall held. He had no idea how profoundly that decision would change everything. Ezra spent the next 3 days learning the land. He walked the property boundaries as best he could, determined them from the legal description, marking trees with his knife as he went. The parcel was larger than he'd expected, maybe 160 acres, stretching from the river up through forest to a high ridge. All of it centered on that magnificent waterfall. He found game trails everywhere, deer, elk, even fresh bear sign. The hunting would be good here. The fishing, too. The pool below the falls was full of trout. And he caught enough for dinner his second night with nothing but a bent pin and some line. But it was the waterfall itself that drew him back again and again. He'd sit on the rocks and watch it, mesmerized by the endless cascade of water, the way the light changed throughout the day, the constant music of it. There was something about this place that settled into his bones, made him feel more at peace than he had in years. On the 4th morning, as mist rose off the pool in the early cold, Ezra decided to explore closer to the falls themselves. He'd noticed what looked like a ledge behind the curtain of water, a dark shadow that might be nothing or might be something worth investigating. He took his rifle, though he didn't expect trouble, and his old cavalry knife. Moving carefully on the wet rocks, he worked his way along the cliff face toward the falls. The mist soaked him within minutes, and the roar of the water made it impossible to hear anything else. There was a path of sorts, not man-made, but a natural shelf of rock that ran behind the cascade. Ezra edged onto it, pressing his back against the stone, feeling the weight and power of the water falling just inches from his face. Behind the waterfall was a cavern. It wasn't large at first, maybe 10 feet deep, carved out by centuries of water and erosion. But as Ezra's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw that it went back farther, into the mountain itself. He struck a match, and in its brief flare, he saw evidence that others had been here before. There were marks on the stone, scratches that might have been deliberate. And there, tucked into a crevice, the remains of a fire pit long cold. The match burned down to his fingers. He lit another. Someone had camped here. Not recently. The ashes were ancient, scattered by time. But someone had known about this place and used it. Ezra returned to his camp and made torches, pine branches wrapped with strips of cloth soaked in rendered fat from his supplies. Not ideal, but they'd burn long enough. He also found a coil of rope in his packs and fashioned a simple harness in case he needed to climb or rappel. That afternoon, he went back. The cavern extended much farther than he'd thought. With the torch held high, Ezra moved deeper, stepping carefully over loose rocks and pools of standing water. The walls were smooth in places, rough in others. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the enclosed space. He found more evidence of previous visitors. A rusted knife blade snapped off at the handle, some rotted leather that might have been a boot. And then, wedged between two rocks, a journal. It was water-damaged, the pages swollen and stuck together, but some were still legible. Ezra carried it carefully back to the fire pit area, where more light filtered through the falls, and examined it by torchlight. The handwriting was crude but readable. The first entry he could make out was dated July 1856, found the cathedral today. Jake said I was crazy, but I knew it was here. The stories were true. The falls hide it just like the old flathead said they would. Ezra turned pages carefully, trying to find more. Been 3 days in the cave. Jake took sick from the cold. I told him we should have brought more blankets. The gold has to be here somewhere. The map showed it clear enough. More pages, illegible. Then another fragment. Jake died last night. Fever took him. I buried him outside, above the pool where the ground is soft. This place is cursed. The Indians were right. You can hear things in the deep caves, voices that aren't voices. I'm getting out while I can. Let the gold stay lost. The journal ended there. The remaining pages were too damaged to read. Ezra sat back, processing what he'd read. Gold. A man named Jake, who died. References to maps and Indian stories. And most troubling, warnings about the place being cursed, about voices in the deep caves. He wasn't a superstitious man. He'd seen too much real horror in the war to believe in ghost stories. But the trapper's fear was palpable, even through water-stained pages and 20-year-old ink. That night, camped by his fire, Ezra considered his options. The smart thing would be to leave well enough alone. He had the land, beautiful land that could sustain him. That should be enough, but he'd been a soldier. He'd led men into danger because that was the job. And he'd never been one to leave a mystery unsolved when solving it was possible. There was also the matter of gold. If there really was gold hidden somewhere in those caves, it could change everything. He could repair his cabin, buy better traps, maybe even save enough to have something to leave behind when he was gone. Though he had no one to leave it to. The next morning, he returned to the cavern with more torches and a length of rope tied around his waist, the other end secured to a boulder outside. If he fell or got lost, he could follow it back. The deeper he went, the larger the cavern became. It opened into what the trapper's journal had called the cathedral, a chamber so vast his torchlight couldn't reach the ceiling. The walls here were different, smoother, with strange acoustics that made every sound echo and multiply. And there, scattered on the floor, he found them, gold coins, not many, maybe a dozen, scattered among the rocks like someone had dropped them in haste. Ezra picked one up. It was heavy, real, stamped with the date 1858, and an eagle on one side. His heart beat faster. If there were loose coins here, there might be more. The trapper and his friend Jake had been looking for something. Maybe they'd found it and Jake had died before they could carry it out. Ezra searched systematically, moving in a grid pattern across the cathedral floor. He found more coins, 30 in all. And then, wedged in a crack behind a fallen boulder, a rusted iron lockbox. It took him 20 minutes to work it free. The lock was corroded, but a few strikes with a rock broke it open. Inside were more gold coins, maybe 300 of them. Rotted paper money that crumbled at his touch. And beneath that a wanted poster. Ezra unfolded it carefully. The face staring back at him was weathered and hard, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. The text read, "Wanted for train robbery and murder, James Rutledge. Reward, 1,000 dead or alive." Below that, more detail. Rutledge and his gang had robbed a train near Fort Benton in 1861, making off with a military payroll shipment worth $20,000 in gold. They'd killed 2 guards in the process. The gang had disappeared into the Northern Territories and was never caught. Ezra sat back on his heels, understanding dawning. This wasn't just any gold. This was the legendary Rutledge gold, the subject of campfire stories for nearly 20 years. Men had searched for it, died looking for it. And here it sat in a cave, behind a waterfall on land that now belonged to him. But there was something else in the lockbox. A hand-drawn map on oiled leather, still intact. It showed the cavern system in detail, with notations and markers. And at the bottom, drawn in careful lines, were symbols that looked like arrows pointing deeper into the mountain. There was more. The gold here was just the beginning. Ezra studied the map by torchlight, trying to match it to the chamber he was in. If the drawing was accurate, there were at least 3 more chambers deeper in the mountain. And in the deepest one, someone had drawn a symbol he didn't recognize, a circle with lines radiating from it like the sun, or maybe like water spreading out. The smart thing would be to take what he'd found and leave. 300 coins was more wealth than he'd seen in his entire life, but Ezra had never been content with partial answers. And something about that symbol on the map called to him, whispered that the real secret of this place lay deeper still. He'd come back tomorrow with more supplies, better light, and a clear head. Whatever was hidden in the depths of this mountain, he was going to find it, though part of him wondered if that was wise. The trapper's journal had warned that this place was cursed, that there were voices in the deep caves. Ezra didn't believe in curses. But as he made his way back through the narrowing passages toward the light and thunder of the waterfall, he could have sworn he heard something, a sound like whispering. Just below the range of the water's roar, he told himself it was nothing, just echoes and his imagination. But he walked a little faster anyway. Ezra spent that night wrestling with decisions. The lockbox sat beside his fire, the gold coins catching the light. He'd counted them twice, 347 coins, each one worth $20. Nearly $7,000, more money than most men earned in 10 years. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like a burden. The gold wasn't his, not really. It was stolen from a military payroll, taken during a robbery that had left 2 men dead. The law would want it back, but the robbery had happened 17 years ago. The men who died were long buried. The army that had owned it had disbanded after the war and reformed. Who exactly would he return it to? And what would happen if word got out? If men learned that Ezra Cole had found the Rutledge gold, they'd come. Greedy men, desperate men, violent men. This peaceful place would become a battleground. The journal's warning kept circling his thoughts. This place is cursed. Let the gold stay lost. Maybe that trapper had been smarter than Ezra was giving him credit for. But the map called to him. There was something deeper in the mountain, something that symbol represented. And Ezra had learned long ago that the only way to truly solve a problem was to understand it completely. In the morning, he prepared carefully. He took his rifle, though what good it would do against falling rocks or bad air, he didn't know. His cavalry knife, 3 torches, a coil of rope, and a canteen. He also took the map, studying it one more time before entering the cavern. The path to the cathedral chamber was familiar now. But beyond it, following the map's directions, he found a narrow passage he'd missed before. It sloped downward at a steep angle, the walls closing in until he had to turn sideways to fit through. Ezra had never liked tight spaces. During the war, he'd once been trapped in a collapsed trench for 4 hours, and the memory still woke him some nights. But he pushed forward, telling himself the passage would open up. It did, eventually, into a smaller chamber. This one was different. The walls were unnaturally smooth, almost polished. And there, carved into the rock face, symbols. They weren't letters, not any alphabet Ezra knew. They were geometric shapes, circles within circles, triangles, lines that intersected in complex patterns. They'd been carved deep into the stone, the work of someone with considerable skill and time. Ezra ran his fingers over them, feeling the grooves. These weren't random scratches. They meant something. According to the map, there was one more chamber, the deepest one. The passage to it was marked on the leather with a warning symbol, 3 wavy lines that probably meant water. Ezra found it soon enough. A narrow opening, half filled with standing water. He could hear the sound of dripping echoing from somewhere beyond. This was as far as the trapper had gone, Ezra realized. This was where Jake had taken sick from the cold and damp. They'd turned back before finding whatever lay beyond. Ezra stood at the edge, his torch reflected in the dark water. It was maybe 3 feet deep, maybe more. The passage beyond looked tight. If he went through and the water got deeper, if the ceiling got lower, he could drown down here and no one would ever find him. The smart choice was to turn back, but Ezra had come this far. And that symbol on the map, the radiating sun or water, it represented something important. He could feel it. He took a deep breath and waded in. The water was shockingly cold. It soaked through his boots and pants, made his legs ache within seconds. He held the torch high, trying to keep it dry, and pushed forward. The passage was maybe 20 feet long. The water got deeper, up to his chest at one point, but the ceiling stayed high enough to breathe. And then he was through, climbing out onto dry rock on the far side, shivering and dripping. The chamber beyond was the largest yet, and it was unlike anything Ezra had ever seen. The walls were covered with carvings, floor to ceiling. Not just symbols now, but images, animals, human figures, celestial shapes. The moon in its phases, the sun with rays spreading out. Scenes that might have been hunts or ceremonies or battles. And in the center of the chamber, carved directly into a massive stone pillar, the symbol from the map. A circle with radiating lines, each line ending in a smaller circle. It was easily 6 feet across, carved so deep that Ezra could fit his whole hand into the grooves. This was no outlaw's hiding place. This was something far older. Ezra moved closer, his torch casting dancing shadows across the ancient artwork. Some of the figures were familiar, deer, buffalo, bears. Others were strange, abstract, almost dreamlike. At the base of the pillar he found something that made his breath catch, a stone tablet, flat and rectangular, covered with more of the geometric symbols. It had been placed deliberately, positioned as if on display or as an offering. He picked it up carefully. It was heavy, maybe 30 pounds, the stone smooth and dark. The symbols on it were even more complex than those on the walls, arranged in precise rows and columns. This was writing, he realized. Not English, not any European language, but writing nonetheless. Someone had created this, carved these symbols with meaning and purpose. They'd built this chamber, decorated it, left this tablet as a message. But who and when? Running Bear's words came back to him. Stories from before my grandfather's time. About the land before the people came. The Salish had been in this region for centuries, maybe longer. But these carvings suggested something even older. A civilization that had lived and worked and worshipped here long before any tribe he knew of. Ezra sat down on the cold stone, overwhelmed. He'd come looking for stolen gold and found instead evidence of something that rewrote what he thought he knew about this land. The gold suddenly seemed unimportant. This ancient place, these carvings, this tablet, this was the real treasure. This was what Uncle Nathaniel had wanted to protect, but why leave it to Ezra? What did Nathaniel expect him to do with this knowledge? As he sat there in the torchlight, surrounded by the work of hands long turned to dust, Ezra felt the weight of something he couldn't quite name. Responsibility, maybe, or destiny, or simply the recognition that some things were bigger than one man's life, bigger than gold or land or any material concern. This place was sacred, not in the way a church was sacred, but in a deeper, older way. And somehow it had fallen to him to decide what happened to it. He stayed in the chamber for an hour, studying the carvings, trying to understand. He found no more gold, no treasure in any conventional sense, just the tablet, the symbols, and the profound silence of a place where humans had left their mark thousands of years ago. Finally, his torch burning low, Ezra made his way back. Through the cold water, through the narrow passages, back to the cathedral chamber where the Rutledge gold lay scattered. The gold seemed tarnished now, tainted. It represented greed and violence and death. The deeper chamber represented something pure, untouched, important. When Ezra emerged from behind the waterfall, the sun was setting. He was cold to his bones, exhausted, but his mind was racing. He knew what he had to do. The gold he would leave where it lay. It had caused enough suffering already. But the sacred chamber, the carvings, the tablet, those he would protect. The question was, protect them from what? He'd been alone here for days. But something told him that wouldn't last. Somehow word would spread. And when it did, men would come. They always did. Ezra knew he needed guidance. The carvings and the tablet were beyond his understanding. So 4 days after his discovery, he rode back to Samuel's trading post, leaving his camp hidden and the cavern entrance unwatched for the first time. Samuel greeted him with his usual good humor. "Back already? Thought the land would keep you longer." "It's keeping me," Ezra said. "But I need to talk to Running Bear. Is he around?" Samuel's expression shifted, reading something in Ezra's tone. "Came through yesterday. Said he'd be camped up at Willow Creek for a few days. That's about an hour north." Ezra found him there as the sun was setting. Running Bear sat by a small fire, working on a deerskin with a stone scraper. He looked up as Ezra approached, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting the visit. "The land called to you," the old man said. It wasn't a question. Ezra dismounted. "I found something. I need you to see it." They rode out the next morning, Running Bear on a paint horse that moved like water. The old man was silent for most of the journey, but as they climbed into the high country, he began to speak. "My grandfather told me stories," he said, "about the time before the people came to these mountains. He said there were others here first, people who knew the stone and the stars. They built places of power, places where the earth spoke to the sky. Most were destroyed or forgotten, but some remained. What happened to them?" Ezra asked. "These people? No one knows. They vanished, or died, or became something else. The stories are old and the details are lost." Running Bear looked at the mountains ahead. "But their works remain, and places touched by such power do not forget easily." When they reached the waterfall, Running Bear sat on his horse for a long moment, not speaking. Then he dismounted slowly, his face grave. "This is the place," he said quietly. "The one my grandfather spoke of." "I thought it was legend only." Ezra led him through the path behind the falls. He'd left torches prepared, and they lit them before descending into the cavern system. Running Bear moved carefully, touching the walls occasionally, his expression unreadable. When they reached the chamber with the first symbols, the old man stopped. He studied them for a long time, then nodded to himself. "These are not of the people," he said. "Not Salish, not Blackfoot, not any tribe I know. These are from the old ones. Who were they? As I said, no one knows. But they understood things we have forgotten. How to read the stars, how to mark the seasons, how to speak with the land itself." Running Bear traced one of the symbols with his finger. "These marks, they are about water and time and the cycle of all things. This I can feel, though I cannot read the words." Ezra led him deeper through the water-filled passage and into the final chamber. Running Bear's breath caught when he saw the pillar with the great radiating symbol. He stood before it for a long time, so still that Ezra thought he might have gone into some kind of trance. Then the old man knelt, pressing his palms flat against the stone floor. "This is a sacred place," he said softly, "more sacred than I can express in your language. This is where the old ones spoke with the powers that make the world. The water above, the stone below, the symbols connecting them. This is a temple, Ezra Cole, a place of great importance." Ezra showed him the tablet. Running Bear examined it with hands that trembled slightly. "This should be protected," the old man said. "Guarded, kept safe from those who would not understand its meaning. That's why I brought you here." "I don't know what to do with all this." Running Bear looked at him with ancient eyes. "Your uncle knew. That is why he left this place to you." "You knew Nathaniel?" "I met him once, many years ago. He came to our winter camp seeking counsel. He had found this place and wished to know its meaning. Our elders told him what they could, and they made an agreement with him." Running Bear pulled something from inside his coat, a folded piece of hide. He left this with us, to be given to his heir when the time came. Ezra took the hide and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a document written in English on official paper, dated 1851. It was an agreement between Nathaniel Cole and a council of Salish elders. In it, Nathaniel pledged to protect the sacred site and prevent its desecration in exchange for the tribe's blessing on his stewardship. The document was signed by Nathaniel and witnessed by 3 tribal leaders, their marks carefully made. "He protected this place for nearly 30 years, Running Bear said. He lived near it, kept others away, and when he felt death approaching, he ensured it would pass to someone he trusted. To you." The weight of it settled on Ezra like a physical thing. "Why me? I barely knew him. Perhaps that is exactly why. He knew you were a man of integrity. He knew you had seen enough of the world to understand that some things are more important than personal gain." Running Bear gestured to the chamber. "You found the outlaw's gold, yes? How did you know?" "The stories of Rutledge's robbery are known to us as well. And this place, it draws such things to it. Gold, greed, violence. Your uncle kept them all at bay." The old man's expression was serious. "Now that burden falls to you. Will you accept it?" Ezra thought about his simple life, his quiet existence in the mountains. He thought about the gold lying in the cathedral chamber, enough wealth to change his circumstances entirely. And he thought about this place, this ancient temple carved by forgotten hands, and what it would mean if greedy men found it. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll protect it." Running Bear nodded, satisfied. "Then you should know, this place is forbidden to my people. We do not come here. We do not speak of it openly. If you choose to guard it, you will stand alone. I can offer counsel, but I cannot offer warriors. I understand. Do you?" The old man's eyes were sharp. "Men will come, Ezra Cole, men who hear rumors of gold, men who want the land, men who will not be turned away by one old soldier, no matter how determined. Your uncle was younger when he took on this task, and still it wore him down to nothing by the end." "Then I'll have to be smarter than him," Ezra said, "and I'll have to be ready." They emerged from the cavern as the sun was setting, painting the waterfall in shades of gold and red. Running Bear prepared to leave, but before mounting his horse, he placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "You have a good heart, Ezra Cole, but a good heart alone will not be enough for what is coming. You must be willing to fight. You must be willing to do what is necessary. I fought a war once," Ezra said quietly. "I can fight again if I have to." Running Bear nodded slowly. "War changes a man. But defending sacred ground, that is different. That is not about victory or defeat. It's about standing firm when all else crumbles." He mounted his horse. "I will keep your secret, Ezra Cole, but secrets have a way of escaping into the world. Be watchful." After the old man left, Ezra stood by the waterfall as darkness fell. The sound of it filled the night, constant and eternal. He thought about Nathaniel, living here alone for decades, keeping watch over something most people would never understand or value. It was a lonely calling. But then Ezra had been lonely for a long time anyway. At least now his solitude had purpose. He returned to his camp and began to plan. If men were coming, and Running Bear's certainty suggested they were, then Ezra needed to be prepared. He needed to understand the approaches to this place, the best defensive positions, the ways someone might try to reach the cavern. Over the next week, he scouted thoroughly. There were 3 main approaches: the valley trail he'd used, a steep ridge path from the east, and a narrow game trail from the north. He marked them in his mind, noted places where one man could hold off several, places where traps could be set if necessary. He also went back into the cavern and moved the Rutledge gold. It felt wrong leaving it in the cathedral chamber, where anyone exploring might find it. He carried it deeper, past the symbol chamber, and hid it in a crevice behind a fall of rocks. Then he carefully obscured the entrance to the water passage, making it look like a dead end, the sacred chamber with the tablet and carvings that he left undisturbed. But he memorized every detail of it, making his own crude map in case something happened to him and someone trustworthy needed to find it later. It was during his 10th day at the property. While he was chopping firewood near his camp, that the first strangers arrived, two men on horseback riding up the valley trail. They looked trail-worn and hard-used, the kind of men Ezra had learned to recognize during his scouting days, prospectors or drifters, always looking for the next opportunity. Ezra set down his axe and waited, his rifle leaning against a nearby tree, close enough to reach. The men reined in a respectful distance away. The older one, a weathered fellow with a grey beard, called out, "This the Cole property?" "It is," Ezra said. "Can I help you?" "Name's Harker. This here's my partner, Dutch." The man gestured to his companion, a younger fellow with nervous eyes. "We heard tell you inherited some land up here. Mighty pretty spot. It suits me. I bet it does." Harker smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thing is, we're prospectors by trade. Been working these mountains for 5 years now. We heard rumors about this area. Old rumors, mind you, about gold and such. Wondered if you might be interested in a partnership. We provide the mining expertise, you provide the land. We split whatever we find fair and square." Ezra shook his head. "Not interested in mining. I'm keeping the land as is." "Now hold on," Harker said, his smile fading. "Don't be hasty. There could be real wealth here. Enough for all of us." "I said no," Dutch spoke up, his voice tight. "We heard about the waterfall. Heard there might be caves behind it, so word had already spread." Ezra kept his face neutral. "There's nothing back there but wet rock and darkness." "I've looked. You sure about that?" Harker's tone had turned cold. "Because we also heard stories about the Rutledge gold, about how it was hidden somewhere in these mountains. Funny coincidence, you inheriting land right where the old stories place it." "Stories are just stories," Ezra said. He moved slightly, positioning himself closer to his rifle. "And this land is mine, legally deeded and registered. You're welcome to look for gold on public land, but this property is private." Harker stared at him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. "You're making a mistake, old man. When word gets out about this place, you won't be able to hold it alone. Might be smart to have some friends. I'll take my chances." The two men exchanged glances. Then Harker shrugged. "Your funeral." "Come on, Dutch." They rode off, but Ezra watched them until they disappeared from sight. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating hard. That had been a test, he realized. They'd been gauging him, seeing if he'd scare easy, or if he'd be trouble. He'd shown them he wouldn't scare. But that might just make them more determined. That night, Ezra didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about Harker's words. When word gets out about this place, you won't be able to hold it alone. The man was right. Ezra was one person, getting older, with limited ammunition and resources. If determined men came in numbers, he couldn't stop them all. But he'd made a promise. To Uncle Nathaniel's memory. To Running Bear and the Salish elders. To himself. He would protect this place, no matter what it cost. The next morning, he rode back to Samuel's trading post. He needed supplies, more ammunition, food stores, tools. And he needed to send a letter to the lawyer in Helena, making sure his claim to the property was ironclad and properly registered. Samuel noticed his mood immediately. "Trouble?" "Maybe," Ezra said. "Had some prospectors sniffing around? They'll be back. Word spreading then." Samuel lowered his voice. "There's been talk. Nothing specific, but men asking questions about your inheritance, about what might be up there. Let them talk. The land is mine, Ezra." Samuel's expression was serious. "If there's really something valuable up there, talking won't stop them. You know that." "I know. Then maybe you need help. I could ride up, stay a while." "No." Ezra shook his head firmly. "You've got Mary and the post to look after. I won't drag you into this, you stubborn fool. You can't face down every greedy bastard in the territory by yourself. I can try." Samuel sighed heavily, but helped him load supplies. As Ezra was preparing to leave, the trading post owner pulled him aside. "At least promise me you'll be smart about it. Don't go getting yourself killed over some rock and water. It's more than that, Samuel. I can't explain it all, but it's more important than you know." The older man studied his face, then nodded. "I believe you. Just come back alive, you hear?" Ezra rode back to his property with his supplies, and a growing sense that he was racing against time. The encounter with Harker and Dutch had been just the beginning. More would come, and eventually, someone would come who wouldn't be turned away by words or warnings. When that day arrived, Ezra would have to be ready to do more than talk. He would have to fight. The next interruption came 3 days later, and it was more official. Ezra was fishing in the pool below the waterfall when he heard horses. He set down his pole and walked back to his camp, arriving just as a well-dressed man on a fine bay horse rode into the clearing. The man was maybe 40, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that had no business being in the wilderness. Behind him rode a younger fellow who had the look of a hired gun, hard eyes, and a tied-down pistol. "Mr. Cole?" The suited man dismounted with the careful movements of someone unused to riding. "My name is Albert Hutchins. I work for the Montana Territorial Survey Office." Ezra nodded, but didn't extend his hand. "What can I do for you?" "I'm here to verify the boundaries of your property. Standard procedure when land changes hands." Hutchins pulled a leather case from his saddlebag and extracted some papers. "According to our records, you inherited 160 acres from Nathaniel Cole, deceased. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "Excellent. Then you won't mind if my assistant and I spend a day or two surveying the boundaries. We need to make sure everything aligns with the territorial maps." Hutchins smiled. "Purely routine, I assure you." Ezra didn't believe him for a second. "I've already walked the boundaries. They're clear enough?" "I'm sure they are. But the territory requires official verification. I have authorization right here." He held out a document with official seals. Ezra took it and read carefully. It looked legitimate, but something about Hutchins set his teeth on edge. The man was too smooth, too polished. And his assistant was clearly muscle, not a surveyor's helper. "How long will this take?" Ezra asked. "A day, perhaps 2. We'll stay out of your way, I promise." Ezra knew he couldn't legally refuse. The document was valid. "All right, but you'll camp on the south edge of the property, away from my site, and you'll stay clear of the waterfall area. The rocks there are unstable." Hutchins' eyes flickered with interest at the mention of the waterfall. "Of course. We'll be respectful of your property." Over the next day and a half, Ezra watched them. Hutchins had brought expensive surveying equipment, a brass transit, measuring chains, a compass. They appeared to be doing legitimate work, mapping and measuring. But Ezra noticed that Hutchins kept finding reasons to work closer to the waterfall, to ask questions about the rock formations, to probe gently about whether Ezra had explored the area thoroughly. On the second afternoon, Ezra caught the hired gun, who'd been introduced as Mr. Blake, trying to sneak around behind the waterfall. "Lost your way?" Ezra said, stepping out from behind a tree with his rifle cradled in his arms. Blake froze. For a moment his hand twitched toward his pistol. Then he relaxed and smiled. "Just looking around. Didn't mean any harm. The camp is a 1/4 mile that way. I suggest you return to it." "Sure thing, old-timer." Blake's smile was ugly. "No offense meant." After Blake left, Ezra positioned himself where he could watch the waterfall approach. An hour later, Hutchins appeared, ostensibly checking measurements, but clearly trying to get a better look at the falls. "Impressive sight," Hutchins called out. "How far back does the cave system go?" "There is no cave system, just a shallow overhang." "Really?" "Because I've heard stories about this area. Old prospector tales about caverns and—" "Stories are just stories, Mr. Hutchins. You've done your surveying. I think it's time you moved on." Hutchins studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Of course. We'll finish up tonight and leave in the morning." He paused. "Mr. Cole, I feel I should be honest with you. This land has significant potential. My employer, Mr. Cassidy of the Montana Development Corporation, would be very interested in purchasing it from you. We're prepared to offer substantially more than its assessed value. Not for sale. You haven't heard the offer yet. Don't need to. The land stays with me." Hutchins' pleasant expression cracked slightly. "Mr. Cole, you seem like a reasonable man, but you should understand that this territory is changing. Development is coming whether you want it or not. A man alone can't stand against progress. I can try. That would be unfortunate." Hutchins' voice was colder now. "For you, I mean. Accidents happen in these remote areas. Men disappear. Claims get contested. It would be much simpler and safer if you simply accepted a fair price and moved on. Ezra kept his face neutral, but his grip on the rifle tightened. That sounds like a threat, Mr. Hutchins. Not at all. Merely an observation about the realities of frontier life. Hutchins mounted his horse. We'll be gone by morning. But you'll hear from us again, Mr. Cole. The Montana Development Corporation always gets what it wants. One way or another, they rode out at dawn, and Ezra watched them go with a growing sense that he'd just made a powerful enemy. He didn't know who this Cassidy was, but a man who ran a development corporation would have resources, money, lawyers, hired guns. That afternoon, Ezra found evidence that Hutchins and Blake had left something behind, or rather, someone. Tracks in the soft earth near the south boundary, too fresh to be from the surveyor's departure. Someone was watching the property. Ezra didn't try to find them. Let them watch. Let them report back that he was here and vigilant. Maybe it would buy him time. He spent the evening reinforcing his camp, setting up trip lines at the main approaches and making sure his ammunition was dry and ready. He also moved his most important possession, Uncle Nathaniel's papers and the treaty document running, Bear had given him, into a waterproof oilskin pouch that he could carry with him at all times. If things went bad, if he had to run, those documents would prove his right to the land and the sacred nature of the site. They might be the only things that could protect this place if he failed. As night fell and the waterfall roared in the darkness, Ezra sat by his fire and faced the truth he'd been avoiding. This wasn't going to end peacefully. The land was too valuable, the secrets too tantalizing. Men like Hutchins and whoever his employer was, they wouldn't give up. They'd escalate. And Ezra was one aging soldier with limited supplies and no backup, but he'd made his choice. He'd accepted the responsibility Nathaniel had passed to him, and he'd be damned if he'd surrender without a fight. He just hoped. He'd be smart enough and lucky enough to survive what was coming, because something told him the worst was yet to arrive. A week passed without incident. Ezra used the time to prepare, but the waiting wore on him. He knew they were out there, Hutchins' watchers or others who'd heard the rumors. The silence felt like the calm before a storm. On the 8th day, while exploring a section of the cavern he'd bypassed before, Ezra made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been examining the wall near the sacred chamber, looking for any passages he might have missed. The stone here was different, smoother, more deliberately shaped. As he ran his hands along it, feeling for irregularities, one section felt hollow. He pressed harder, and with a grinding sound, a piece of stone shifted inward. It was a door of sorts, or a panel, so perfectly fitted that it had been invisible until touched in just the right place. Behind it was a small alcove, maybe 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. And inside that space, carefully arranged, personal items, a folded blanket rotted with age, but still recognizable, a tin cup and plate, a leather satchel, surprisingly well preserved, and wrapped in oiled cloth papers. Ezra's hands trembled as he unwrapped them. There were letters, a journal, and his breath caught a photograph. The photograph was faded but clear enough. It showed a younger Nathaniel Cole, maybe in his 30s, standing in front of the waterfall. Beside him was a native woman, beautiful and dignified, wearing traditional dress. And between them, holding both their hands, a child perhaps 5 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong features. Ezra turned the photograph over. On the back, in Nathaniel's handwriting, Morning Star, Thomas, and myself. Summer 1847. The happiest days of my life. Morning. Star, Thomas, a family Ezra had never known, existed. He opened the journal with shaking hands and began to read by torchlight. The entries spanned decades, beginning in 1846. Nathaniel had come to this region as a trapper and had met Morning Star, daughter of a Salish chief. They'd fallen in love, married in the traditional way, and had a son, Thomas. This land, Nathaniel had written in 1847, is where my heart lives. The waterfall, the forest, the sacred caves that Morning Star's people showed me, all of it feels like home in a way nothing ever has before. I will protect this place for my family for as long as I draw breath. But tragedy had found them. Morning Star had died in 1852 during a hard winter from a fever that no medicine could break. Nathaniel's grief poured from the pages, raw and devastating. She is gone, and half of me is gone with her. Only Thomas keeps me here. Only my son gives me reason to wake each morning. The entries became sparse after that, years between them sometimes. But Ezra pieced together the story. Thomas had grown up between two worlds, accepted by his mother's people, but aware he was different. When he was 16, there had been trouble. A fight with white prospectors who'd called him a half-breed, said things about his mother. Thomas had nearly killed one of them. Nathaniel had sent him away to avoid reprisal, given him money and a horse, and told him to head west. Go to California or Oregon, he'd written. Make a new life where no one knows your blood. Come back when it's safe, but Thomas had never come back. The last entry about him was dated 1865, 20 years since I've seen my son. I sent letters to the addresses he gave me, but they come back unopened or undeliverable. I don't know if he's alive or dead. I don't know if he hates me for sending him away. All I know is that this land, our land, where his mother is buried, will be his someday. If he never returns, I will leave it to someone who will protect it. I will leave it to Ezra, my brother's son, who I remember as a boy with an honest heart. Ezra sat back against the stone wall, overwhelmed. He had a cousin. Nathaniel had a son, which meant Ezra wasn't the only heir, or shouldn't have been. Thomas had a right to this land, perhaps more right than Ezra himself. But where was Thomas? After more than 30 years, was he even alive? The letters in the satchel offered more answers. They were copies of letters Nathaniel had sent, carefully preserved. Addresses in San Francisco, Portland, Sacramento, all trying to reach his son. One letter, dated 1876, just 2 years ago, had a different address, a mining camp in Colorado. Thomas, it read, if this reaches you, know that I am failing. The doctor in Helena says my heart is giving out. I have perhaps a year, perhaps 2. I would see you again before I die. I would tell you about your mother, about this land, about the sacred trust I have kept. Please come home. There was no indication whether Thomas had received that letter or any of the others. Ezra looked at the photograph again, at the child's face. His cousin would be in his 30s now, probably 40. A grown man living who knew where, possibly unaware that his father was dead and that strangers were threatening the land his mother had loved. The realization hit Ezra with the force of a physical blow. He was protecting this place, not just for some abstract principle, but for family. For a cousin he'd never met who had every right to know about his inheritance. And more than that, Thomas would have knowledge Ezra lacked. He'd been raised by Morning Star, taught the Salish ways. He would understand the sacred sites, the carvings, the ancient symbols. He could be the key to truly understanding what this place meant. Ezra carefully repacked the items, except for the photograph and the last letter with the Colorado address. These he took with him, wrapped in the oilcloth and tucked into his coat. As he made his way out of the cavern, his mind was racing with plans. He needed to find Thomas Greywolf. That would be his name, Ezra realized. The name Morning Star would have given him. He needed to bring him home, to tell him about Nathaniel's death and his inheritance. But could he leave the land unprotected long enough to search? And how would he even begin to track down a man who might be anywhere in the West? He emerged into daylight to find he had visitors. A single rider sat on horseback at the edge of his camp, hands clearly visible and empty. The man was native, about Ezra's age, with long black hair streaked with grey and a weathered face that spoke of hard years. Ezra Cole? The man said in clear English. That's me. The rider dismounted slowly. My name is Thomas Greywolf. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Ezra stared, his mind reeling. It was impossible. He'd just been thinking about finding this man, and here he was, as if summoned by the thought itself. Thomas saw his expression and smiled grimly. You look like you've seen a ghost. I suppose in a way you have. I'm Nathaniel Cole's son. How did you? Ezra couldn't finish the sentence. I received my father's last letter 6 months ago. I was in Colorado, as he suspected, working a mining claim. Thomas's voice was steady, but Ezra could hear the emotion beneath it. By the time I made it back to Montana, he was already dead. The lawyer in Helena told me about you, about the inheritance he'd left to his nephew instead of his son. There was no accusation in his tone, but Ezra felt the weight of it anyway. I didn't know you existed. I swear it. I only just found out today. He pulled the photograph from his coat. I found this, hidden in the cavern. Your father left letters, a journal. He tried to reach you. Thomas took the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight. My mother, he said softly. I barely remember her. I was so young. He loved her very much. The journal makes that clear. Then why did he send me away? Thomas's voice broke slightly. Why did he let me go and never come after me? He was protecting you. There'd been trouble with prospectors, violence. He thought you'd be killed if you stayed. Thomas nodded slowly. I know, I understood it then, even as a boy. But understanding and forgiving are different things. He looked up at Ezra. So what now? Do we fight over this land? Do you claim your legal inheritance while I claim my blood right? Ezra met his eyes. No, we share it. Your father wanted this place protected. I don't think he cared who did the protecting as long as it got done. If you're willing, we'll do it together. Thomas studied him for a long moment. You mean that? I do. This land is bigger than both of us, and from what I've learned, we're going to need all the help we can get to hold it. I heard there's been trouble. Prospectors, developers, worse than that. There's a company that wants the land, and they won't stop until they get it. Ezra gestured to the camp. I could use a partner in this fight, especially one who knows his mother's people and their ways. Thomas looked past him to the waterfall, his expression complex, grief and longing, and something like coming home. I never thought I'd see this place again. I dreamed about it, but I never thought I'd stand here. Your father kept it safe for you. Now it's ours to keep safe. Then I'll stay. Thomas extended his hand. Partners. Ezra shook it firmly. Partners. And family. For the first time since arriving at this land, Ezra didn't feel alone. The burden he'd been carrying seemed lighter, shared now with someone who had even more reason to protect this place than he did. They had a lot to discuss: the sacred chamber, the Rutledge gold, the threats from Hutchins and his employer. But for now, as the sun set over the waterfall and two men who'd never met before stood side by side, it felt like something had shifted. The land had brought them together, and together they might actually have a chance. That night, by the fire, Ezra and Thomas shared their stories. Thomas spoke of the years wandering, working mines and lumber camps, always feeling out of place in the white world, but never quite fitting into his mother's world either. He'd learned to survive alone, to trust few people, to keep moving. I got that last letter from Father in March, Thomas said, staring into the flames. I left Colorado the next day, but the passes were still snowed in, and I got delayed in Wyoming. By the time I reached Helena in July, he'd been dead 3 months. He paused. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell him I understood why he sent me away. He knew, Ezra said. The journal makes that clear. He never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping you'd come home. Thomas nodded slowly. The lawyer gave me Father's personal effects. Among them was this. He pulled something from his coat, a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath. The handle was carved bone, etched with symbols. My mother made this for him. He wore it every day of his life. Ezra recognized some of the symbols from the sacred chamber. It's beautiful. It's more than beautiful. It's powerful. My mother's people believe that objects can carry the spirit of their makers. This knife carries her strength, her protection. Thomas slid it back into its sheath. I'll need that strength for what's coming. What do you know about what's coming? More than you might think. In Helena, I heard talk. This Cassidy who wants your land, our land. He's not just a businessman. He's a railroad magnate with political connections. He wants to build a resort here, some kind of mountain retreat for wealthy Easterners. The Waterfall would be the centerpiece. A resort. Ezra felt his stomach turn. That would destroy everything. The The sacred chamber, the caves, all of it. That's exactly what he intends. And he has the resources to make it happen, unless we stop him. Ezra poked at the fire. How do two men stop a railroad magnate? Very carefully. Thomas's expression was grim. I also heard he's hired a man named Clayton Voss. You know that name? Ezra did. Every lawman and soldier in the territory knew that name. Clayton Voss was a killer, an outlaw who'd somehow avoided hanging by being just careful enough, just smart enough. He hired out to men who needed dirty work done, and he had a reputation for being thorough. How many men does he have? Ezra asked. Last I heard, 11 plus himself. Former Confederate raiders, claim jumpers, general desperados. The kind who'll kill for pay and not lose sleep over it. 12 men against 2. Ezra calculated the odds. They weren't good. Maybe not just 2. Thomas looked toward the dark forest. I sent word to my mother's brother before I came here. He's an elder now, one of the council who signed that treaty with my father. If I ask, he might send warriors. Running Bear already told me his people won't come here. This place is forbidden to them. For most, yes. But my uncle is different, and the threat to sacred ground might change the council's thinking. Thomas stood and stretched. I'll ride to their winter camp tomorrow. It's 2 days there and back. Can you hold the land alone for that time? I've been holding it alone for weeks. Voss isn't here yet. When he comes, it'll be different. Then move fast. And Thomas, Ezra met his eyes. Thank you for staying, for being willing to fight. This is my mother's land, my father's legacy, and apparently my inheritance too. Thomas smiled slightly. Where else would I be? The next morning, Thomas rode out before dawn. Ezra watched him go, then set about preparing for the worst. If Voss and his men came while Thomas was gone, Ezra needed every advantage he could create. He spent the day setting traps along the 3 main approaches, deadfalls made from balanced logs, tripwires connected to bells and pans, false trails that led to impassable thickets. Nothing that would kill a man outright, but things that would slow them down, make noise, create confusion. He also prepared fallback positions. The best defensive spot was behind the waterfall itself. A few men there could hold off many, at least for a while. He stashed supplies in the cavern, ammunition, food, water in sealed containers, blankets and medical supplies. On the second day, Samuel arrived unexpectedly, riding hard. "Ezra!" he called out. "You need to hear this." Ezra emerged from the tree line, rifle in hand. "What's wrong?" "Voss and his gang. They were in my trading post yesterday, asking about you. They know exactly where you are and what you're sitting on." Samuel dismounted, breathing hard. "They're coming, Ezra. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but they're coming. And they're not planning to negotiate. How many did you see?" 12, all armed to the teeth. Voss is a big man, bold, with a scar across his throat. You can't miss him." Samuel grabbed Ezra's arm. "Come back with me. You can't stand against 12 killers. I don't have a choice. Everyone has choices. This is just land, Ezra. It's not worth dying for. It's more than land." Ezra gently removed Samuel's hand. "I can't explain it all, but trust me when I say some things are worth the risk." Samuel's eyes were desperate. "Then let me stay and help. I can shoot. I fought in the war, same as you. You have Mary waiting for you. I won't make her a widow, and who'll mourn you if you die here?" Ezra smiled sadly. "Thomas will, my cousin. You didn't know about him, but he's here now. And he's gone to get help. How much help? I don't know. Maybe enough. Maybe not." Samuel stood there, clearly torn. Finally, he pulled a pistol from his saddlebag. "Take this. It's loaded and I've got extra ammunition." He handed it over along with a box of cartridges. "And Mary sent this." He gave Ezra a cloth-wrapped package. Inside was fresh bread and smoked meat. "She said to tell you she's praying for you. Tell her thank you." And Samuel, Ezra clasped the older man's shoulder. "If things go bad, if you hear that I didn't make it, get word to the territorial marshal. Tell him about Cassidy and Voss. Tell him what they tried to do here. I will. But you come through this, you hear me? You come through and tell him yourself." After Samuel left, Ezra felt the loneliness settle back in. But it was different now. He wasn't just a solitary mountain man anymore. He had people who cared, who would remember him. That mattered. Thomas returned that evening, and he wasn't alone. 3 young Salish warriors rode with him, all in their 20s, all looking capable and serious. And behind them, on a travois pulled by a paint horse, was Running Bear. "Couldn't let you boys have all the glory," the old man said as they helped him down. "My bones are old, but my rifle still shoots straight." "You shouldn't be here," Ezra protested. "This will be dangerous. I'm 83 years old. Everything is dangerous at my age." Running Bear's eyes were sharp despite his years. "Besides," the council decided, "this sacred ground must not fall to greedy men. We will stand with you." Thomas introduced the warriors, Swift Hawk, Riverstone, and Broken Lance. Each nodded to Ezra with respect, but no warmth. This alliance was born of necessity, not friendship. "They know the land," Thomas said. "They know how to fight. They'll follow my lead, and I'll follow yours." Ezra looked at the 6 of them, 7 counting himself. Still outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, but the odds were better. "Much better. Thank you," he said to all of them. "Thank you for coming." Swift Hawk spoke in Salish, and Thomas translated, "He says the old ones called to him from this place. He says his mother's mother's grandmother spoke of the water temple, though she never saw it herself. To defend it is an honor," that night they planned. Ezra showed them his traps and defensive positions. Thomas added suggestions based on his knowledge of ambush tactics from his years working dangerous camps. The warriors studied the terrain with the practiced eyes of men born to this land. "They'll come up the main valley trail," Ezra said, marking it in the dirt with a stick. "It's the easiest approach. We'll want scouts here and here," he marked positions, "to give us warning." "I'll take that post," Riverstone said through Thomas. "I can move quiet as shadow." "Swifthawk and I will position in the trees along the eastern approach," Thomas added. "If they split their forces, we'll have them flanked." Running Bear studied the rough map. "And if they bring dynamite? If they try to blast their way in?" It was a sobering thought. Ezra had seen what explosives could do. Then we'll have to stop them before they can set charges. The sacred chamber can't be collapsed. It would be lost forever. "My father's rifle," Thomas said quietly. "The Winchester he carried for 40 years. It's in the cavern, isn't it? The one you've been using?" Ezra nodded. He'd found the rifle in Nathaniel's hidden cache, along with the letters. "It shoots true. I've named it Justice, after my old unit. Then let it serve justice one more time." Thomas checked his own weapon, a newer Henry rifle with a brass receiver that gleamed in the firelight. "Between us, we have enough firepower to make them think twice." Broken Lance spoke, and Thomas translated, "He asks about the gold. He says, if the white men want gold so badly, perhaps we could lead them to it and trap them in the caves." Ezra considered this. "It's deep in there, past water and narrow passages. We'd be risking the sacred chamber if fighting happened that close. Then we make our stand outside," Thomas decided. "We hold the approaches. We make them pay for every foot of ground." They worked through the night, refining positions, distributing ammunition, preparing fallback routes. Running Bear took charge of the camp, setting up a small field hospital of sorts, with what medical supplies they had. Cloth for bandages, whiskey for disinfecting wounds, needle and thread for stitches. As dawn approached, Riverstone returned from his scouting position. He spoke rapidly in Salish, his face urgent. Thomas translated, "They're coming." 12 riders moving up the valley trail. "They'll be here by midday." The moment had arrived. Ezra felt his old soldier's instincts kick in. The calm focus that came before battle, the heightened awareness of everything around him. He checked his weapons, Nathaniel's Winchester, Samuel's pistol, his cavalry knife. Everything was ready. "Positions," he ordered. "Thomas, take Swifthawk and get to the eastern flank. Broken Lance, you're with me behind the waterfall. Riverstone, stay mobile, you're our eyes. Running Bear, stay here at camp and watch for anyone who gets through." As they moved to their positions, Thomas pulled Ezra aside. "If I don't make it through this, you will. But if I don't, there's something you should know. The symbols in the sacred chamber. My mother taught me about them before she died. They're a calendar, a way of marking the seasons and the stars. But more than that, they're a map to other sacred sites across these mountains. This place is just one of many. Ezra stared at him.
How many others?
At least 7 that I know of from the stories. Maybe more. All connected, all part of something the old ones built long ago. Thomas's expression was intense. If this place falls, we need to protect the others. That knowledge can't die with us. It won't. We're going to survive this. Thomas gripped his shoulder. Then I'll tell you the rest when it's over. When we're sitting by the fire as free men on our own land. They took their positions as the sun climbed higher. Ezra and Broken Lance crouched behind the waterfall, the constant thunder of water making speech impossible. They communicated with hand signals, watching the approaches through breaks in the cascading sheets. The waiting was always the hardest part. Ezra had learned that in the war, the moment before battle, when you could still think, still imagine everything that might go wrong. Once the shooting started, training took over. But now, in the silence before the storm, every man faced his own thoughts. Ezra thought about his life, the years of loneliness, the quiet endurance, the sense that he was waiting for something without knowing what. And now he knew. He'd been waiting for this, for a purpose larger than survival, for a reason to stand and fight. He thought about Uncle Nathaniel, protecting this place for decades. About Morningstar, who'd loved these mountains enough to make them sacred. About Thomas, who'd come home after 30 years to defend his mother's legacy. This was what mattered. Not gold or property or personal gain. This standing together against those who would destroy something precious for profit. Through the waterfall's mist, Ezra saw movement. Riders emerging from the forest, 12 of them in a loose column. They moved with the confidence of men who expected no real resistance. At their head rode a massive figure, Clayton Voss. Even at this distance, Ezra could see the scar across his throat, pale against tanned skin. The man's face was brutal, all hard angles and cold eyes. They reached the edge of Ezra's camp. Voss raised a hand, stopping his men. He looked around slowly, taking in the empty campsite, the cold fire, the absence of defenders. "Cole," he shouted, his voice carrying over the waterfall's roar. "I know you're here. Make this easy on yourself. Come out and sign over the deed. You can walk away alive." Ezra didn't respond. "Let them wonder. Let them worry." Voss waited a moment, then shrugged. "Your choice." He turned to his men. "Spread out. Search everything. Find him. And if he won't sign," he made a throat-cutting gesture, "make sure he can't sign anything ever again." The men dismounted and began moving toward different areas of the property. 3 headed toward the waterfall. 4 moved east, toward where Thomas and Swifthawk waited. The remaining 5, including Voss, stayed near the camp, searching Ezra's belongings. Ezra watched the 3 approaching the waterfall. They moved carelessly, rifles held loosely. They didn't expect trouble. They should have. The first man triggered a tripwire. Bells jangled, and a heavy log swung down from the trees. It caught him in the chest and sent him flying backward into his companions. All 3 went down in a tumble of limbs and curses. Shots rang out from the eastern approach, Thomas and Swifthawk engaging the 4 men who'd wandered into their ambush. The forest exploded with gunfire and shouting. Voss's head snapped around. "It's a trap. Fall back to cover!" But it was too late for easy retreat. The battle had begun, and Ezra Cole, veteran of Shiloh and Stones River, guardian of sacred ground and defender of his family's legacy, stepped out from behind the waterfall with his rifle raised. "You're on my land," he said quietly, though his voice carried in a momentary lull, "and you're not welcome here." Then he fired, and the world erupted into chaos. Ezra and Thomas exchanged glances. A parley could be a trap, or it could be a chance to end this without more bloodshed. "What do you want?" Ezra shouted back, face to face. "You and me, no guns." "Don't trust him," Thomas said quietly. "He'll have a knife. He'll try something. I know, but maybe I can buy us time. Get the others into better positions while I keep him talking." Thomas gripped Ezra's arm. "If he tries anything, I'll put a bullet in him. I'll be watching from cover." Ezra nodded and began walking toward the valley entrance, his rifle left behind, but Samuel's pistol tucked into the back of his belt, hidden under his coat. His cavalry knife was strapped to his leg, concealed. Voss emerged from behind a tree, his hands empty and visible. The big man was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and he moved with a slight hitch. One of their shots had found him, at least partly. They met in the middle of the clearing, maybe 30 yards from either side's cover. Close enough that their respective allies could intervene if needed, far enough that they could talk. "You're a stubborn old bastard," Voss said. There was something like respect in his tone. "I'll give you that. I'm protecting what's mine." "For what?" "You can't win this. I've got more men coming. Cassidy's sending reinforcements. By tomorrow, there'll be 20 guns pointed at you instead of 8. Maybe you're bluffing." "I'm not." Voss's scarred throat worked as he swallowed. "Look, I don't have anything personal against you. This is just business. Cassidy wants the land and he pays me to get it. But you've made this expensive. 3 of my men are dead. 2 more are shot up bad. That comes out of my profit. Then leave. Tell Cassidy the land's not for sale." "Can't do that. I've got a reputation to maintain." Voss studied him. "But here's what I can offer. Sign the deed over now, and I'll let you and your friends ride out alive. You get to keep whatever you found in those caves, gold, artifacts, whatever. Just the land itself goes to Cassidy." "No. Why not? What's so important about some rocks and water?" How could Ezra explain? How could he make this killer understand about sacred ground, about legacy, about promises that transcended material value? "Some things aren't about money," Ezra said finally. "Some things matter more. That's fool talk. Everything's about money in the end." Voss shifted his weight. Ezra noticed his hand drift slightly toward his belt. "Last chance, old man. Sign or die. Then I guess I'll die standing." Voss's hand flashed to his belt, pulling a hidden knife. But Ezra had been expecting it, watching for it. His own hand moved, drawing the cavalry knife from his leg sheath. The 2 blades met with a metallic ring. They grappled close enough that Ezra could smell the man's sweat and blood. Voss was younger, stronger, but Ezra had fought hand-to-hand in trenches during the war. He knew how to use an opponent's strength against them. Ezra shifted his weight and swept Voss's leg. The big man stumbled, and Ezra drove his shoulder into his chest, both of them going down hard. Voss's knife slashed, catching Ezra's arm, drawing blood. Pain flared hot and immediate. But Ezra's blade found purchase too, a deep cut across Voss's ribs that made the outlaw roar in pain and anger. They rolled apart, both men coming to their feet, bloodied and breathing hard. Behind them, Ezra could hear shouting, Voss's men starting to move, Thomas and the others responding. The parley had broken down completely, and now it was chaos again. Voss lunged, his knife seeking Ezra's heart. But Ezra sidestepped, grabbed the extended arm, and used Voss's momentum to throw him forward. The outlaw stumbled toward the cliff edge near the waterfall. For a moment, Voss teetered on the brink, arms windmilling. His eyes met Ezra's, wide with sudden fear and understanding. Then Ezra did something that surprised even himself. He lunged forward and grabbed Voss's coat, pulling him back from the edge. They fell together onto solid ground, both gasping. Voss stared at him in disbelief. "Why?" The outlaw managed. "Because I'm not a killer," Ezra said. "Not unless I have to be." Gunfire erupted around them. Thomas's Henry rifle cracked repeatedly. The Salish warriors whooped as they closed in from multiple angles. Voss's remaining men, already demoralized by losses, broke completely. "Retreat!" One of them shouted. "It's not worth it!" They ran for their horses, those who could. Some were wounded and had to be helped by their companions. In the confusion, Ezra and Voss lay on the ground, both bleeding, both exhausted. A shadow fell over them. Thomas stood there, his rifle pointed at Voss's head. "Say the word," Thomas said to Ezra, "and I end him." Ezra looked at Voss. The outlaw leader's face was pale, his hand pressed to his bleeding ribs. He was beaten and he knew it. "Let him go," Ezra said finally. "Let them all go. As long as they leave and don't come back." "You're making a mistake," Thomas warned. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Ezra stood painfully, his arm throbbing where Voss had cut him. He looked down at the outlaw. "You tell Cassidy this land is protected. Tell him what happened here. Tell him that if he sends more men, the result will be the same." Voss struggled to his feet, one hand still pressed to his wound. He looked at Ezra with an expression that was part anger, part confusion, and part grudging respect. "You could have let me fall," he said quietly. "I could have. But that's not who I am." Voss nodded slowly, then turned and limped toward where his remaining men were gathering their wounded and their dead. He mounted his horse with visible effort, then looked back one last time. "This isn't over, Cole. Cassidy won't stop. Then we'll be ready." Voss rode off, his broken gang trailing behind him. Ezra watched them go until they disappeared into the trees, then finally let himself sag. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain from his arm was intensifying. Thomas caught him as his knees buckled. "Easy, let's get that wound tended." Running Bear was already preparing bandages. As the old healer worked on Ezra's arm, cleaning and binding the knife wound, Ezra looked around at their small group. Swift Hawk and Broken Lance, both wounded but standing. Riverstone unscathed but solemn. Running Bear moving stiffly but determined. And Thomas, his cousin, his family, standing guard with the rifle that had been his father's. They'd won. Against the odds, they'd held the sacred ground, but Voss's words echoed in Ezra's mind. This isn't over. He was right. This was just the beginning. 3 months had passed since the battle. Autumn had given way to early winter, and the first snows dusted the high peaks surrounding the waterfall. The land wore its white coat like a protective blanket, pristine and quiet. Ezra stood at the edge of the pool, watching the waterfall in the morning light. His arm had healed, though it still ached when the weather turned cold. A long scar ran from his elbow to his wrist, a permanent reminder of the day he'd defended this place. Behind him, smoke rose from 2 cabins now instead of 1. Thomas had built his own dwelling on the far side of the property, near where his mother was buried. Ezra had helped, and together they'd created something solid, something that would last. The territorial marshal had come 2 weeks after the battle, summoned by Samuel's urgent message. He'd listened to their account, examined the evidence, and arrested 2 of Voss's men, who'd been found wounded in a nearby town. The investigation had reached all the way to Cassidy himself. The railroad magnate had been quietly encouraged to abandon his resort plans. It turned out that several territorial officials were uncomfortable with the methods he'd used. And when Ezra had produced the treaty document between Nathaniel and the Salish elders, proving the land's sacred status, the legal ground had shifted entirely. The Rutledge gold had been quietly returned to the territorial government, which had used it to compensate the families of the guards killed in the original robbery. Ezra and Thomas had kept nothing of it, wanting no part of that cursed wealth. The important treasure, the sacred chamber with its ancient carvings, remained hidden and protected. Thomas had begun documenting everything his mother had taught him about the symbols and the old, and he worked by candlelight in the evenings, creating a ledger that would preserve the knowledge for future generations. It was painstaking work, translating oral tradition into written words, but Thomas approached it with the dedication of someone who understood its importance. The Salish warriors had returned to their people, honored for their defense of sacred ground. But Swifthawk came back to visit sometimes, and he and Thomas would talk late into the night in the old language, keeping the connection alive. Running Bear had passed away peacefully in his sleep a month after the battle. Thomas and Ezra had helped his people lay him to rest according to tradition, and they'd both felt the weight of losing a wise counselor. But the old man had died knowing the sacred ground was safe, and that seemed to be enough for him. Samuel still rode up once a week with supplies and news. He'd become more than a friend. He'd become part of the extended family that this land had created. Mary sent food regularly, and the 3 of them, Ezra, Thomas, and Samuel, would share meals and stories, building the kind of bonds that only shared danger could forge. On this particular morning, as Ezra stood watching the waterfall, he heard horses approaching. He turned to see Thomas riding up the valley trail, but he wasn't alone. A woman rode beside him, native, beautiful, with kind eyes and a quiet dignity. And behind them, on a smaller horse, rode 2 children. Thomas dismounted and helped the woman down. His face was transformed, younger somehow, lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. "Ezra," he said, and there was joy in his voice. "I'd like you to meet my wife, little bird. And these are our children, Joseph and Sarah." Ezra felt his throat tighten with emotion. He hadn't known. Thomas had never mentioned a family. "I sent word to them after the battle," Thomas explained. "Told them it was safe to come home. They've been living with her people in Oregon, waiting for me to find a place we could settle." He looked around at the land, the waterfall, the cabins. "This is it. This is where we'll raise our children." Little Bird stepped forward and took Ezra's hands in hers. She spoke in Salish, and Thomas translated, "She says you have a generous heart. She says our family is honored to share this land with you." The children, Joseph, perhaps 8, Sarah, maybe 5, stared at Ezra with wide, curious eyes. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to their level. "Welcome home," he said softly. "Your father was very brave. You should be proud of him," Joseph nodded solemnly. Sarah just smiled and reached out to touch the scar on Ezra's arm. Her finger traced it gently, and something in that innocent touch broke through Ezra's usual reserve. Tears pricked his eyes. He'd thought he would live out his days alone. He'd accepted that solitude as his fate. But here, in this place that had demanded so much, he'd found something he'd never expected: family. Not just blood family like Thomas, but a family built through shared purpose and mutual respect. That evening, they all gathered around a fire between the 2 cabins. Samuel had arrived with his wife, Mary, who'd insisted on coming to meet the new arrivals. She'd brought enough food to feed an army, as was her way, as they ate and talked. As the children played near the fire, under the watchful eyes of their parents, Ezra pulled out the family ledger he'd begun keeping. It was bound in leather, its pages already filling with stories, names, dates. He wrote carefully by firelight. November 1878, Thomas Greywolf's family arrived today. Little Bird, Joseph, and Sarah. The land that was once protected by one man is now home to a family. The sacred ground remains safe, the ancient carvings undisturbed, the waterfall eternal. What began as an unexpected inheritance has become something greater, a legacy of protection that will pass from generation to generation. My Uncle Nathaniel would be proud. His son has come home. The circle is complete. Ezra set down his pen and looked around at the people gathered by the fire. Thomas caught his eye and raised his cup in a silent toast. Ezra returned the gesture. He thought about his life, all the years of solitude, the losses, the hard survival. And he thought about this moment, surrounded by family and friends, with purpose and meaning. Sometimes a man spends his whole life with nothing, wondering if he'll ever catch a break. Ezra had caught his break in the most unexpected way, not through gold or easy fortune, but through the challenge of protecting something precious. Through that challenge, he'd found everything he'd been missing: family, purpose, belonging. The waterfall roared in the darkness behind them, constant and eternal. It had been here long before Ezra arrived, and it would be here long after he was gone. But for now, in this moment, he was part of its story, and that was enough. More than enough, it was everything.